Benjamin Hughes had owned a chain of restaurants located in several districts of Chicago for many years. The businessman wasn't young anymore, but he still remembered well the times when he was so poor that he had to count every single dollar. Benjamin started his business with a small restaurant located in the suburbs. It actually looked more like a cafe by modern standards, but for the determined young man, it was the first step on the path to wealth and success. At first, he couldn't even afford to hire enough employees, but he didn't care, since he managed to take on the jobs of the security guard, the waiter, and the manager. Over time, the restaurant got a few regular customers and started bringing its owner a decent income, which allowed the businessman to think about expanding his network. Of course, it took Benjamin years to create his empire, but in the end, the time and effort he spent doing it certainly paid off. Despite his age, Mr. Hughes continued to personally monitor the development of his business and didn't want to entrust this important task to anyone else. Each of the restaurants had its own manager that was responsible for the operations of that particular establishment. It would seem that the business had everything under control. All he had to do was supervise the managers, while they each dealt with the staff of the restaurants entrusted to them. Nonetheless, once in a while, Mr. Hughes still chose to get involved in the affairs of his staff, regardless of their status or position. He could stand up for a waiter who got insulted by a customer, or fire a dishonest manager who tried to steal money from the restaurant. Anyone who knew Benjamin Hughes knew that, despite his wealth, he remained a kind and fair person. However, contrary to the popular belief that rich life is always a happy one, wealthy people suffer from a sudden twist of fate just as much as everyone else. For Benjamin Hughes, that twist of fate was a sudden disease that caused his health to deteriorate very quickly. The elderly businessman first learned that he had cancer about 8 months ago during his routine checkup. "Are you sure? Could there be a mistake?" the man asked, having a hard time keeping his emotions in check. "Unfortunately, there's no mistake, Mr. Hughes. We double-checked the test results and confirmed the diagnosis," the oncologist answered, trying to avoid looking into the patient's eyes. "So how much time do I have left? A month? 2 months? Half a year?" the businessman asked. "Mr. Hughes, it's too early to talk about a specific time frame or give a definite prognosis. You can give up and live a month at best, or you can fight and get to live much longer," the doctor answered, trying to be as straightforward as possible. That explanation was enough for Benjamin. The elderly businessman realized that it was time to reconsider his take on life. Having returned home, Benjamin couldn't think of anything else but his future. The elderly businessman suddenly realized that he didn't want to work anymore, even though his business was the meaning of his entire life. But in order to retire, the businessman had to find a successor. Benjamin Hughes knew that it wasn't going to be easy. There were many candidates, but how was he supposed to choose the most worthy one? Of course, the elderly businessman could have let his children take over control of his chain, but he knew that it wouldn't end well. The fact was that Mr. Hughes' sons weren't accustomed to hard work or doing business, and simply enjoyed their rich lives, which is often characteristic of children from wealthy families. Benjamin needed a person with strong business acumen and unshakable faith in the success of the restaurant business. The thought of finding a successor stuck in the man's brain like a splinter and haunted him for several days. Going over the resumes of the candidates for the position of the head of the entire chain, Mr. Hughes realized that he was at a complete loss. And when it seemed to the elderly businessman that he reached a dead end, one very interesting thought came to his mind. What if I take a look at the operations of each restaurant from the inside? Only not as an owner, but as a customer. Even better, I should come to the restaurants not as a regular customer, but in a completely different role, Mr. Hughes thought, wrinkling his forehead. That day, he stayed up late in his office. Ultimately, the elderly businessman decided to disguise himself as a homeless person and test the reaction of the managers to this unusual situation. The next day, Benjamin Hughes purchased a set of clothes at a flea market, which he got all dirty before putting on. Ripped jeans, a stretched sweater, and worn-out shoes have changed the businessman beyond recognition. Skeptically examining his reflection in the mirror, Mr. Hughes added a false beard and a faded baseball cap with the broken visor. "Well, now my own mother wouldn't recognize me," said Benjamin in a hoarse voice characteristic of many homeless people. The first on his list was a restaurant in the heart of Chicago, which was very popular among the residents of the city. The building gleamed with lights and perfectly washed windows. The restaurant looked in accordance with all the norms of his chain, and Benjamin Hughes knew this like no one else. Stopping at the door, Mr. Hughes cleared his throat and cautiously stepped inside. It was rather cool inside the restaurant, and the sweet smell of cinnamon lingered in the air. The businessman disguised as a homeless person didn't manage to take more than 5 steps before getting stopped by a security guard. "Hey, old man, where are you going? This isn't a homeless shelter or a soup kitchen," the big man said. "Excuse me, sir, I would like to have a snack. I have money. Not much, of course, but it's enough for a couple of ham sandwiches," Benjamin replied. "No way. Not on my watch. I don't think the manager will be interested in the change coming out of your pockets," the security guard replied, getting irritated. Mr. Hughes nodded understandingly and then asked to see the manager. The elderly businessman knew that the restaurant was run by Nicholas Green, who he personally appointed to this position 5 years ago. But at the time, the newly made manager promised Mr. Hughes to take care of each and every customer and increase his profits by all means possible. At the request of the homeless man, Nicholas soon came to the dining hall. "What is this tramp doing here?" the manager asked the guard, not even bothering to say hello to the homeless man. "I'm sorry, sir. I didn't mean to bother you. I just want a couple of ham sandwiches, and that's it. If you don't mind, I could get them and to take away." The disguised businessman hastened to respond. "I don't even want to hear about it. Get out of here. I'm not about to let you scare away all our customers. Get out right now, or I'll have to call the police," Nicholas replied in a tone that brooked no objections. This wasn't the kind of answer that Mr. Hughes expected, so tears welled up in his eyes. The businessman suddenly realized that he'd been deceived in the most shameless way for way too many years. Dragging his feet, Benjamin Hughes left his own restaurant, where poor people were treated with outright contempt. Next in line was the lower-ranking restaurant, which was also managed by a man appointed by Mr. Hughes himself, just like the previous establishment. At that restaurant, the disguised businessman wasn't allowed to even come inside at all. Instead, he was threatened to get beaten up if he didn't leave. Laughing at the homeless man, the manager couldn't even suspect that he would soon lose his job. That day, Mr. Hughes went by almost all of his restaurants, and poor people were treated with undisguised contempt and malice at every single one of them. The most disappointing part for Benjamin was that he wasn't even asking for free food. He was willing to pay for his order, as he kept telling all the managers, "How did I hire so many awful people? How can I trust someone who only sees value in money?" The elderly businessman thought with tears in his eyes. He had only one restaurant left to visit, the one that started his life's work. Sighing sadly, Mr. Hughes stepped inside the restaurant and was immediately met by the guard. The disguised businessman was preparing himself for yet another outburst of anger, but the security guard treated him with unexpected courtesy. "Good afternoon, sir. Come in, take a seat. The waiter will be with you shortly," the man said with sincere cordiality in his voice. Hiding a smile at the corners of his lips, Benjamin Hughes looked around the room, which was full of customers. He was immediately approached by the manager, who personally supervised the servers. Seeing the homeless man in the hall, Alfred Parker didn't lose a beat and immediately offered him his help. Despite the fact that there were no empty tables, the manager managed to seat the disguised businessman at an additional table, which was hidden from the prying eyes in the corner of the restaurant. Even though the homeless man only ordered 2 sandwiches, Alfred added a glass of orange juice and vanilla ice cream for dessert. At that moment, Benjamin Hughes realized that he had finally found someone worthy to continue his life's work. The businessman knew that Alfred Parker had started as an ordinary waiter and worked his way up to the management position, so he understood all the intricacies of the restaurant business better than anyone else. Once upon a time, Mr. Hughes gave a chance to a man who was going through a painful divorce and who had a lot of problems. And now, 10 years later, the businessman saw a completely different Alfred Parker in front of him. Having become a successful manager, Alfred could no longer imagine himself working in a different place. But the most important thing was that the manager didn't divide his customers into rich and poor, but treated both of them with equal respect. Benjamin Hughes left the restaurant in a great mood and went home. After taking off his dirty clothes and taking a shower, the businessman sat down to work. There were a lot of changes he needed to implement, which mostly concerned the managers of his restaurants. The very next day, all of the managers were fired. Alfred Parker was the only one to escape this fate. Moreover, he even got a promotion, the kind he could never have even dreamed of. Thanks for your great work, Alfred. If everyone treated homeless people the way you do, a lot of people in this city would feel much better, Benjamin Hughes said, shaking hands with the new head of the business. Now that he'd found his successor, the businessman was finally able to retire. The man didn't know how much time he had left, but he intended to use every second of it to make this world a better place for everyone around him.